The air in the Louisiana bayou is a wet, heavy blanket you can't throw off. It smells of rot and life, of decay and bloom, all mixed into one thick, cloying perfume. The mud sucks at my boots with a sound like a wet kiss, trying to hold me, to make me part of the swamp's slow, eternal digestion. Tonight my prey was a rougarou, a local variant of the lycanthropic curse, meaner and more cunning than most. I wasn't here with a high-powered rifle for a trophy shot. This was pest control. Extermination. My shotgun was loaded with silver buckshot, but that was the last resort. The real work was in the preparation. I'd spent the day weaving consecrated monofilament line, thin, strong as wire, and blessed by a backwoods priest with a penchant for exorcisms, between the knees of ancient cypress trees, creating a nearly invisible web. A poultice of wolfsbane and graveyard dirt, pungent and earthy, was smeared on a deer carcass I'd dragged a mile through the muck to serve as bait. The rougarou, for all its brute strength, was still a creature of instinct and folklore. You hunt it with its own rules. I was crouched in the low branches of a water tupelo, the humidity making my shirt stick to my skin like a second hide when it finally appeared. It moved on all fours, a hulking mass of matted fur and over-muscled limbs, its shadow gliding over the dark, still water. It sniffed the air, its head low. It was smart. It circled the bait twice, yellow eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. But hunger, the driving force of its curse, won out. As it lunged for the carcass, its forelegs snagged a tripwire. A net of the consecrated line, weighted with blessed iron, dropped from the trees, enveloping it. It thrashed and screamed, a sound that was half wolf howl, half human shriek. The sacred line didn't hold it for long, but it sizzled against its hide, burning and weakening it. That was all the time I needed. I raised the shotgun, sighted on its center mass, and squeezed the trigger. The roar was deafening in the sudden silence of the swamp. Back in my secluded cabin, the stench of swamp water and gunpowder clinging to me, I showered and tried to wash the night away. It never works. The grime comes off, but the memories stain. I was nursing a glass of cheap whiskey when my laptop pinged. The email was encrypted, as always. It was from a new client, the mayor of a town I'd never heard of. Pinerest, Oregon. The message was stripped of all emotion, a cold recitation of facts. 3 tourist disappearances in the last 2 months. Bodies found, or what was left of them. Mutilated. Local sheriff's official report. Grizzly bear. The mayor disagreed. The wounds were atypical. The email concluded with a map of the region and a proposed payment figure. I had to read it twice. A 6-figure sum. $200,000 up front with another $300,000 upon completion. It was enough to let me retire from this ugly business for good. The next day was spent packing. My old Ford F-150 groaned under the weight. It wasn't just about firepower. I packed my professional kit, high-intensity UV flashlights for tracking blood and other fluids that the naked eye would miss, a forensic kit for making plaster casts of prints, high-frequency audio recorders to capture sounds beyond the range of human hearing. I packed my library, a few worn paperbacks on cryptozoology, and, more importantly, a thick leather-bound volume on the indigenous folklore of the Pacific Northwest. Finally, there was the personal arsenal. Jars of fine silver dust, bundles of dried wolfsbane, and a thick tallow-based salve that masked my human scent. The drive north was a journey between worlds. The humid, teeming life of the South slowly bled away, replaced by something colder, more ancient. Louisiana's vibrant greens gave way to the stark, imposing gray and dark green of the Oregon wilderness. The sky turned a permanent, bruised purple shade, and a relentless, chilling rain began to fall. The trees changed. The cypresses and oaks were replaced by colossal Douglas firs and pines, giants that stood in silent judgment, their sheer scale making my truck feel like a child's toy. They crowded the highway, their tops lost in a thick, rolling fog. The world felt bigger here, and I felt smaller, an unwelcome intruder. Pinerest was exactly what I'd pictured. A single main street, bookended by a surly-looking bar, and a sawmill that bled a constant plume of steam into the damp air. A motel sign, the Pine Bough, flickered, one of its neon letters dead. The air was sharp with the scent of wet pine needles and sawdust. As I drove down the street, curtains twitched. Faces peered out from the general store. My truck, with its Mississippi plates and coat of southern dust, might as well have been a spaceship. The mayor's office was small and smelled of stale coffee. He was a nervous man in a suit that was too expensive for this town. He introduced me to the man who was paying the other half of my fee. Jonas, foreman for the Northern Pine Logging Company. He was a wall of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. They seemed to see right through the tired hunter act to the cold professional beneath. His handshake was a vice. He said little, but his presence filled the room. Standing slightly behind him was a younger man, Leo, maybe 19 or 20. He had the same dark hair but was leaner, with a nervous energy that made him constantly fidget with the hem of his flannel shirt. The mayor slid a thick envelope of cash across the desk, the advance, along with a detailed topographical map of the logging territories. That night I checked into the Pine Bough. The room was clean but cold. I spread the map out on the bed, cross-referencing it with the sheriff's reports on where the bodies were found. It was all within Northern Pine's logging concessions. As I worked, I felt it, a prickling on the back of my neck. The same feeling I get when I'm being stalked in the wild, a feeling of being watched. I went to the window and peered out into the misty darkness, but saw nothing but the swirling fog and the dark, silent wall of the forest. Later, deep in the night, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed was profound, absolute. And then I heard it. A distant howl carried on the cold, clean air. It wasn't the sound of a wolf or a coyote or any animal I knew. It was a long, mournful cry, filled not just with predatory hunger, but with a deep, soul-shaking agony. It was the sound of a creature in torment. My work had just begun. The morning broke gray and damp, the fog clinging to the ground like a shroud. I met Sheriff Wallace at the edge of town. He was a man in his late 50s, with a soft belly straining against his uniform and the weary eyes of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. He led me to the site of the last attack, a small clearing just off a hiking trail. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, a flimsy human attempt to impose order on a scene of pure chaos. Wallace gestured vaguely. Grizzly, a big one. Came through here, mauled the poor guy, dragged him off. We found what was left about 100 yards that way. I ignored him and started my own survey. My eyes, trained to see the narrative of violence, immediately picked up on the details Wallace, in his haste to find a simple answer, had missed. There were branches snapped clean off a thick pine bough, a good 8 feet off the ground. No bear climbs that high that clumsily. I ran a gloved hand over the trunk of another tree. Deep gouges, 4 of them, were raked into the bark. but they didn't go sideways as if a bear were marking territory. They went straight up. Whatever did this was a climber. And then there was the most telling detail: the ground itself. There were no drag marks. The victim, a man of at least 180 pounds, wasn't dragged away. He was carried. The strength required for that was staggering. "You're wasting your time, Cross," Wallace grumbled. "It's a bear." "Bears don't climb like squirrels, Sheriff," I said, not looking at him. I knelt, my gaze sweeping the leaf litter. My patience was rewarded. A tuft of coarse dark fur, almost black, was snagged on a thorny bush. I carefully tweezed it into an evidence bag. Then I pulled out my UV flashlight. Even in the daylight, its beam cast a purplish glow. On the leaves of a fern near where the attack must have started, I found it. The faint, spectral splatter of saliva. Another sample bagged. The real prize, however, was near the base of the gouged tree. Preserved in a patch of soft mud was a partial print. I whistled softly. It was huge, but it wasn't a bear print. It was all wrong. The pad structure was canine like a wolf's, but the impression of the heel was distinctly humanoid. It was a hybrid, an anatomical impossibility. I carefully mixed a batch of plaster and poured it into the track, creating a perfect cast of the monster's footprint. That evening I went to the town's only bar, the Rusty Axe. I needed to hear the local chatter. The place was filled with loggers from the Northern Pine Company, their flannel shirts and heavy boots a uniform. When I walked in, the conversation died. Every eye was on me. I was the outsider, the hired gun from the South. I ignored the stares, ordered a whiskey, and then bought a round for the entire bar. It was an old trick, but it worked. The tension eased slightly. The loggers from Jonas's crew kept to themselves at a large table in the back, watching me with unreadable expressions. After a few minutes, the young, nervous kid, Leo, broke away from their table and slid onto the stool next to me. "You're the hunter, right?" he asked, his voice a little shaky. "I'm a consultant," I corrected. "Right, a consultant." He took a sip of his soda. "So, what do you think it is? The thing in the woods?" "Still gathering information," I said noncommittally. "My grandpa used to say there are wolves in these woods bigger than any you've ever seen," he continued, a little too eagerly. "He said they're smart, that they can avoid traps, and that they hunt differently than normal wolves." He was asking all the right questions, probing for what I knew, his curiosity too specific, too informed. It was a clumsy but clear attempt at reconnaissance. The next day, my suspicions were confirmed. Jonas found me at the motel. "Leo knows these woods better than anyone," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He'll be your guide. Show you the territory." It wasn't a suggestion. I knew what it was: a babysitter, a spy to keep tabs on me. "He's been a bit under the weather," Jonas added, a flicker of something like concern in his eyes. "The young ones often get a feverish energy as the full moon approaches. The woods will do him good." I agreed. Out in the forest, Leo's performance was masterful. He was an incredible woodsman. He could hear a twig snap 100 yards away, could smell a deer upwind. But his guidance was a carefully constructed lie. He'd point out old bear scratches on a tree far from the attack sites. He'd show me coyote tracks, explaining how they could be mistaken for something larger. He was actively leading me on a wild goose chase, away from the areas my map indicated were the heart of the activity. I played along, nodding and taking notes, all the while making my own mental map of the places he so carefully avoided. The paranoia in Pinerest was becoming a palpable thing. A woman swore she saw a dog as big as a pony with glowing eyes at the edge of her property. A farmer on the outskirts lost 2 sheep. The pressure was mounting. Sheriff Wallace called me, his voice strained. "The mayor is breathing down my neck, Cross. You need to handle this, and fast." That night, I waited until I was sure the town was asleep. I slipped out of my motel room, dressed in dark clothing, my face smeared with camo paint. I left my truck and went into the woods on foot, armed with my silver-loaded shotgun and a pack containing my night vision gear. I didn't follow the trails. I followed the map in my head, the one showing all the places Leo didn't want me to go. An hour later, using my thermal imager, I found it. A dark spot on the side of a rocky hill, colder than the surrounding earth. A cave. The entrance was shallow, little more than a deep overhang, but the ground inside was packed down and the air hung heavy with a powerful, musky scent. The smell of a lair. And in the back, tucked into a crevice, was a pile of torn, rotting fabric. On top of the pile, unmistakable even in the green glow of my night vision, was the tattered remains of a flannel shirt. The same distinctive pattern as the one worn by the first missing tourist in his photograph. Leo had tried to lead me away, but instead he'd shown me exactly where to look. The evidence was undeniable. The hybrid track, the unnatural strength and cunning, the musky lair, the howling. I was dealing with a werewolf. Not the tortured soul of Hollywood myth, but a territorial, intelligent predator. It was time to stop investigating and start hunting. I spread the topographical map across the cheap motel bedspread. My finger traced the lines of the landscape, connecting the attack sites and the location of the lair. A pattern emerged. There was a narrow ravine, a natural choke point, that served as the most direct path between the creature's den and its hunting grounds to the east. It was the perfect place for an ambush. I wasn't aiming to kill it, not yet. I needed answers, and a corpse couldn't talk. I needed a holding trap. My first stop was the local hardware store. The owner, a grizzled man named Hank, eyed me with the same suspicion as everyone else, but my cash was good. I bought 100 feet of 1/4-inch steel cable, a heavy-duty hand winch, and a dozen forged steel stakes. Back in the sterile quiet of my room at the Pine Bough, the real work began. I spent hours meticulously preparing the trap. Using a pair of pliers, I unspooled the steel cable and carefully wove a thin, almost invisible strand of pure silver wire into its core. It was a painstaking process. Then I donned a pair of rubber gloves and coated the entire length of the cable with a thick, greasy salve I'd prepared. Its primary ingredient was aconite, also known as wolfsbane. The silver would burn the creature on contact, a searing, agonizing pain. The wolfsbane, absorbed through the skin, wouldn't kill it, but it would weaken it, induce paralysis and disorientation. It would make the beast manageable. For bait, I chose the riskiest but most effective lure in my arsenal: human blood, my blood. An experienced hunter, someone who has taken the lives of its kind, carries a certain scent, a signature of threat and challenge that a dominant predator can't ignore. I sterilized a small, razor-sharp knife I kept for just this purpose and made a shallow, clean cut on my forearm. I let a dozen drops of dark, rich blood fall onto a patch of moss I'd collected from the ravine floor. The smell of it, coppery and vital, filled the small room. It was a direct invitation. A challenge. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, I returned to the ravine. The air was cold and still. I worked quickly and silently, my movements practiced and efficient. I drove the steel stakes deep into the earth on either side of the narrow passage, anchoring the winch to the base of a thick fir tree. I rigged the modified cable into a massive, spring-loaded snare, concealing it beneath a careful blanket of fallen leaves, pine needles, and loose soil. I wore gloves the entire time, careful not to leave a single trace of my own scent, apart from the bloodied moss I placed directly in the center of the trap's trigger plate. Leo, my supposed guide, had called in sick that day. The excuse about a feverish energy now clicked into place with chilling significance. I knew the full moon was only 2 nights away. The creature would be getting restless, its hunger and power growing. Time was running out. With the trap set, I climbed the steep side of the ravine, finding a perch about 30 yards away in a dense cluster of ferns and shadows. I settled in, my shotgun resting across my lap, its silver-loaded shells feeling heavy and final. I became part of the landscape, another shadow in a forest full of them. The waiting began. It's the hardest part of the hunt. The minutes stretch into hours, your muscles ache, your mind plays tricks. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sends a jolt through your system. The forest grew quiet, a deep, expectant hush, as if it, too, was holding its breath. It was well past midnight when I heard it. Not the cautious rustle of a deer, but the heavy, deliberate tread of something large and confident. It was moving down the ravine, directly towards my position. A moment later, it stepped into a patch of faint moonlight. It was magnificent and terrifying. A wolf, yes, but a wolf that stood nearly as tall as a calf at the shoulder, its fur the color of jet, its muscles coiling powerfully beneath its hide. Its movements were fluid, intelligent, and utterly purposeful. It was heading straight for the scent of my blood. Its nose twitched. It paused just before the trap, head cocked, sensing something was wrong. But the lure was too strong. It took one more step. The sound was shockingly loud in the silence. The snap of the trigger mechanism, the metallic clang of the winch locking, and the whip-fast sound of the cable pulling taut. It was followed by a roar of fury and agony that ripped through the night. The beast was snared. The steel and silver cable had looped around its powerful front legs, digging deep. I could see smoke, thin and white, rising where the silver made contact with its flesh, and hear a sickening sizzle. It thrashed against its bonds, a whirlwind of claws and teeth, but the trap held. I chambered around and began my careful descent down the slope, my shotgun held at the ready. The beast snarled and lunged at me, the cable straining. I brought the gun up, my finger on the trigger, and looked into its eyes. And what I saw there stopped me cold. Beneath the raw fury and the blinding pain, I saw not the simple rage of an animal, but a terrified, intelligent panic. And in that panic, a flicker of recognition. At that exact moment, the forest around me came alive. There was no sound, no warning. One moment I was alone with the trapped beast. The next I was surrounded. Figures emerged from the trees, moving with a supernatural silence. It was Jonas, the foreman, and his entire crew of loggers. They formed a loose circle around me, their faces grim and unreadable in the moonlight. They weren't armed. They didn't need to be. As I watched, I saw the same inhuman light I'd seen in the trapped wolf's eyes begin to burn in theirs. Jonas stood opposite me, his massive frame silhouetted against the moon. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. What happened next defied every law of nature I knew. A sound filled the ravine, a sickening symphony of cracking bones and tearing fabric. The loggers around me began to change. Their spines elongated with audible pops. Their shoulders broadened. Their faces distorted and stretched into canine muzzles. clothes ripped as their bodies contorted, sprouting coarse, dark fur. The transformation was violent, gruesome, and terrifyingly fast. Within seconds, I was no longer surrounded by men. I was encircled by a pack of werewolves, each standing on its powerful hind legs, muscles rippling, claws extended. Low, guttural growls rumbled from their chests, their collective gaze fixed on me, a dozen pairs of eyes glowing with a predatory light. My instincts screamed. I snapped the shotgun up, the stock firm against my shoulder, the barrel sweeping across the half-dozen threats in front of me. But it was a futile gesture. A bluff. One shot, maybe two, before they were on me. I was a dead man. Jonas, the only one who remained in his human form, raised a hand. "Enough," he commanded. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that cut through the snarling. Instantly, the growls subsided to a low, menacing rumble. The pack stood down, but their eyes never left me. Jonas's gaze shifted from me to the wolf thrashing in my trap. The hard lines of his face softened, replaced by an expression of profound paternal anguish. "That's Leo," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "My son. He's young, impulsive. He hasn't learned to control the hunger yet." The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. Leo's nervous energy, his two specific questions, his incredible senses in the woods, his attempt to lead me astray. He wasn't just a spy. He was trying to protect his own. I slowly lowered my shotgun, though I kept my finger near the trigger. "What is this? What are you?" "We are the Northern Pine Tribe," Jonas said, his eyes meeting mine. There was no malice in them, only a deep, ancient weariness. "The full moon makes us stronger, yes, but it doesn't rule us. We are not slaves to it. We can change when we must, though for the young, like Leo, the control is weak, especially when the moon is waxing. The change becomes painful, driven by instinct." He gestured to the forest around us. "We have lived in these forests for generations. We are guardians, not monsters. The logging company is our cover, a way for us to live in your world without being seen, a way to protect our territory. We keep the balance. We do not hunt humans." "The tourists," I said, my voice flat. "The bodies. You're telling me that wasn't you?" "No," Jonas said, his jaw tightening. "That is why we brought you here. The killings are not the work of my pack. There is something else in this forest now, something ancient and wrong. It kills for sport, for the sheer pleasure of it. Its presence is like a poison, tainting the woods, driving the young ones like Leo to be reckless, to lose control of their instincts." His eyes took on a dark, distant look. "Our elders call it wendigo, the spirit of the hungry wind." The name sent a chill down my spine, colder than the Oregon night. I knew the legends. A creature of insatiable hunger, a cannibalistic spirit. Far worse than any werewolf. "You set me up," I said, the realization dawning. "The money, the job, it was all to get me to hunt it." "We needed an expert," Jonas admitted. "Someone who understands the things that live in the shadows. Someone from outside our tribe who could see what we are too close to see. We were testing you." He then made his offer, the true offer. "Help us, Hunter. Help us find and destroy this evil that has invaded our home. In return, your life will be spared. The rest of the money you were promised will be yours. And Leo." He glanced at his son, still whimpering in the silver-laced trap. "Will be your guide. For real, this time." I looked from Jonas's unyielding face to the circle of werewolves watching my every move, and then to the thing they called a wendigo in my mind's eye. My choices were simple. A quick death here, or a likely death hunting something far worse with a pack of monsters as my allies. It wasn't much of a choice at all. "I agree," I said. A wave of relief seemed to pass through the pack. Jonas walked over to the trapped wolf. He knelt and spoke softly in a language I didn't recognize. A series of guttural clicks and deep, resonant tones. The struggling beast instantly grew calm, its panicked eyes focusing on Jonas. One of the other werewolves, its form retaining more manual dexterity than the others, moved forward. With surprising gentleness, its clawed fingers worked at the winch mechanism, loosening the tension on the cable. The silver-laced wire fell away from Leo's raw, smoking flesh. With a sharp grunt, the werewolf kicked the hated metal cable into the undergrowth far from the pack, before two others helped the now-shrinking form of Leo. Whining in pain, the great wolf's form shuddered and shrank, bones cracking and reshaping until it was no longer a monster. But the exhausted, trembling form of the teenage boy, naked and curled on the forest floor, ugly burns seared into his arms. Two members of the pack gently helped him to his feet and led him away into the darkness. Jonas remained with me. "Get some rest, Hunter," he said, his voice grim. "At dawn, we go into the dark wood. A part of this forest even my people fear to tread." The air of menace had been replaced by a fragile, unnerving alliance. I had come here to hunt a monster, only to find myself employed by a pack of them, on my way to hunt something worse. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. I met Jonas and Leo at the tree line. Leo moved with a stiff, pained gait, his arms wrapped in clean bandages. The bravado and nervousness were gone, replaced by a quiet shame and a newfound, steely resolve in his eyes. He wouldn't meet my gaze. Jonas, looking as if he hadn't slept, pressed a small carved amulet into my hand. It was made of a dark wood and a single, polished black claw. "This will not protect you," Jonas said, his voice low, "but it will warn you. It is tied to the spirit of this forest. When the wendigo is near, you will feel a cold from it. The colder it gets, the closer the evil." I looped the leather thong around my neck. The wood was smooth and cool against my skin. We set off, leaving the familiar, managed parts of the logging territory behind. The deeper we went, the more the forest itself seemed to change. The healthy, vibrant Douglas firs, draped in green moss, gave way to gnarled, sickly-looking trees, their bark pale and peeling, their branches twisted into agonized shapes. The air grew still and unnaturally cold, a malevolence that reminded me of the humid, predatory weight of the Louisiana bayou, but colder, drier, and far more ancient. The cheerful chatter of birds and squirrels faded into an oppressive silence. It felt like we had crossed an invisible border into a dead land, a place that was not only empty of life, but actively hostile to it. This was the dark wood. Leo, no longer hiding his true nature, became an invaluable guide. His senses were a tool far beyond anything in my kit. "The wind is wrong here," he'd murmur, pointing to a ridge where the air should have been moving but was stagnant. He taught me to read the signs of this corrupted place. He pointed out strange, geometric symbols carved into the diseased bark of trees. Symbols that seemed to throb with a faint, dark energy. He showed me tracks that belonged to no animal I knew, long three-toed prints with a deep claw mark at the end. He would stop suddenly, his head cocked, and whisper, "Silence? There is a pocket of it just ahead." These were patches of forest where all sound seemed to be absorbed, a vacuum of absolute quiet that was more terrifying than any noise. In turn, I shared my own knowledge, testing him, building a strange rapport. Some spirits can't cross a line of salt, I'd say, watching his reaction. Others are repelled by the smell of burning sage. He would listen intently, a student of a craft he never wanted to learn. The Darkwood was more than just a place. It was a psychological weapon. It began to play with our minds. I started hearing things in the unnerving silence, a faint whispering voice that sounded disturbingly like my late wife, calling my name from just behind my shoulder. I'd spin around, my hand on my shotgun, to find nothing but twisted, silent trees. Leo was afflicted too. I saw him flinch, his eyes darting into the shadows, and he later admitted he kept seeing flickers of movement, silhouettes that looked like the tourists who had been killed. Jonas remained a stoic rock, his face an unreadable mask, but I could see the tension in the corded muscles of his neck, the way his hand never strayed far from the heavy axe at his belt. The amulet on my chest grew steadily colder, a small patch of ice against my skin. We found the deer in a small, dead clearing. The scene was grotesque. It wasn't just killed, it was violated. Its rib cage had been ripped open with tremendous force, and its organs were gone. Not scattered, not partially eaten. They were cleanly and completely removed, the bones of its torso picked bare, as if scoured by 1,000 tiny knives. But the most disturbing part was the complete lack of blood. The ground around the carcass was pristine. Not a single drop stained the dead leaves. It was as if every ounce of blood had been siphoned out of it before it was torn apart. Jonas knelt, his face grim. He spoke the word I had been dreading, the confirmation of my deepest fears. Wendigo. He finally told me the full legend, his voice a low, somber whisper in the dead quiet of the clearing. The Wendigo was not born, but made. It was the result of a curse, a spirit of eternal, gnawing hunger that could possess a human who had committed the ultimate taboo. Cannibalism in the wilderness. Once it took hold, it twisted the body and devoured the soul. It was a mimic, able to replicate the voices of its victims to lure new prey. It fed on flesh, but it grew stronger on fear. It was a creature of myth and nightmare, nearly impossible to kill by conventional means. "You cannot kill a spirit with bullets or claws," Jonas said, his gaze distant. "You can only banish it. To do that, you must destroy its heart, its anchor, the physical object that ties it to this world." We pushed on, the amulet on my chest now feeling like a block of dry ice. The sense of being watched intensified, a malevolent pressure that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. Finally, we broke through a line of skeletal trees and found the source. We stood at the edge of a large, circular clearing. In its center was a house, or what was left of one. An old prospector's cabin, perhaps, now dilapidated and blackened with age and rot, its roof sagging, its windows like vacant eyes. A palpable wave of cold and pure despair radiated from it, a physical force that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The amulet was now so cold it burned. Jonas turned to me, his face set like stone. "This is its lair. My pack and I will draw it out. We will give you a distraction. You, Hunter, must get inside that house. The spirit's magic guards its anchor. It creates a barrier that repels any creature of the forest, any supernatural being like us. But you are a man. You can pass where we cannot. You must find its anchor and destroy it. You will only have one chance." Jonas tilted his head back and let out a long, resonant howl. It was not the cry of pain I had heard from the motel, nor the call of a lone wolf. This was a summons, a declaration of war. An answer came almost immediately, a chorus of howls from the surrounding woods, and then the pack was there. They emerged from the tree line in their full wolf forms, hulking, powerful beasts of muscle and fur, moving with a coordinated, tactical grace. They didn't rush forward. They fanned out, creating a perimeter around the clearing, a living wall of claws and teeth. They were a family, an army, and they knew exactly what they were about to face. As if summoned by their challenge, it emerged. The door of the blackened cabin didn't open. It simply fell from its hinges, crumbling into dust. The thing that stepped out was a living nightmare pulled from the darkest corners of human fear. It was impossibly tall and emaciated, its skin the color of old parchment stretched tight over a skeletal frame. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a marionette with its strings tangled. Its head was the most horrifying part. A bleached, ancient deer skull, its antlers like a thorny crown, and in its empty eye sockets burned 2 points of piercing sapphire blue light. It didn't breathe. It didn't make a sound of life. But a noise emanated from it, a dry, scraping sound, like ice cracking under immense pressure. And then it whispered, using the voices of its victims. "Help me. So cold. Where am I?" The voices echoed in the clearing, a phantom chorus designed to paralyze with terror and grief. With a guttural roar, the pack attacked. It was a breathtaking, horrifying spectacle, a battle of primal forces. The werewolves, each a pinnacle of physical power, crashed against the wendigo like a wave against a rock. They leaped and tore at it with fangs and claws, a flurry of black and gray fur. But their attacks seemed to do little. Their claws passed through its wispy form as if through smoke, leaving behind only trails of frost. The wendigo, in turn, fought with a terrifying economy of motion. It lashed out with its impossibly long, stick-like arms, which ended in claws like black obsidian razors. Each time a claw connected, it left a deep, grievous wound on the werewolf, a gash that smoked with an unnatural cold and refused to bleed normally. This was my chance. While the battle raged, a whirlwind of supernatural violence, I broke from the tree line and sprinted across the clearing. The chaos was my cover. The wendigo was focused on the pack, this maelstrom of immediate physical threats. I reached the cabin, my boots crunching on the dead, gray earth, and slipped through the empty doorway. The cold inside was a physical blow. It was far colder than the air outside, a deep, penetrating chill that felt like it was freezing my bones. The walls were coated in a thick layer of frost that glittered in the dim light, and strange, spiraling symbols were painted on the wood in what looked like thick, black tar. The air was dense with the smell of old meat, of grave dirt, and a profound, soul-crushing despair that made my chest tighten. I moved through the single dilapidated room, my shotgun held ready. In the center of the room, I found what I was looking for. It was an altar, a grotesque sculpture of human and animal bones, lashed together with sinew and leather straps. And resting in the center of this macabre construction, on a bed of yellowed teeth, was a blackened, shriveled human heart. It was hard as a rock, yet I could almost feel a faint, evil pulse emanating from it. This was it. The anchor. The physical tie that bound the hungry spirit to this plane. My eyes scanned the area around the altar. It was littered with trophies from the wendigo's victims. A tarnished silver watch, a torn piece of a hiking pack, a set of car keys, a driver's license, the face on it frozen in a happy smile. And then I saw it. Tucked partially under a pile of bones was an object that didn't belong, something that broke the pattern of random tourist loot. It was a baseball cap. It was dirty, but the embroidered logo was still clear. Henderson Timber. Arthur Henderson, the owner of the only other major logging company in the region, Northern Pine's biggest and most bitter rival. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a random curse. The Wendigo had been summoned, deliberately. Human greed, as always, was the root of the rot. There was no time to ponder the implications. I could hear the sounds of the battle outside, the snarls of the pack and the high, grating shriek of the Wendigo. They couldn't hold it off forever. I knew what I had to do. Fire cleanses. Fire purifies. I pulled a small metal flask from my belt pack. It was filled with my own special blend, a high-proof alcohol and pine tar mixture that burned hot and fast. I unscrewed the cap and doused the entire bone altar, splashing the flammable liquid over the dried sinew and, most importantly, the desiccated heart. The fumes were acrid. I stepped back, pulled a Zippo from my pocket, flicked it open, and tossed the small flame onto the pyre. The effect was instantaneous. The accelerant-soaked bones and the ancient heart erupted in a whoosh of brilliant, cleansing fire. The moment the flames consumed the altar, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through the air from the clearing outside. It was a shriek that was not of this world, a sound that felt like it could shatter stone and soul alike, a psychic scream that vibrated through my bones. Peering through a grimy, cracked window, I saw the Wendigo on the battlefield convulsing violently. Its semi-transparent form flickered and solidified, the smoky edges of its body condensing into something tangible, something vulnerable. The whispers stopped. The illusion of invincibility was broken. The werewolves, wounded and weary but not broken, saw their chance. A new wave of desperate, furious energy surged through the pack. This was their moment. With a unified roar, they launched themselves forward in a final, all-out assault. Jonas, in his massive alpha wolf form, led the charge. He dodged a final, flailing swipe from the monster's claws and lunged, his powerful jaws closing around the Wendigo's now solid neck. This time, his fangs found purchase. There was a wet, tearing sound and black ichorous fluid, thick as tar, sprayed from the wound. The Wendigo thrashed in its death throes, its physical form wavering like a faulty projection. As the roof of the burning cabin behind me groaned and collapsed inward with a great roar of fire and splintering wood, the Wendigo's form on the battlefield gave one last, silent scream. It didn't fall. It disintegrated. It crumbled into a shower of fine black ash and a plume of greasy smoke that was quickly snatched away by the wind, leaving nothing behind but the stench of ozone and ancient evil. The battle was over. The unnatural cold that had plagued the clearing vanished, replaced by the radiant heat of the burning cabin. The cost of victory was steep. On the now quiet battlefield, several of the werewolves lay panting and bleeding, their fur matted with their own blood and the black ichor of their foe. One of them, a younger male, lay perfectly still, his eyes wide and vacant. Jonas, his form shifting and shrinking back to that of a man, walked over to his fallen packmate. He knelt, placing a hand on the wolf's still chest. The rest of the pack, some limping, some leaning on each other for support, gathered around, their wolfish heads bowed in a silent, mournful vigil. In that moment, stripped of their ferocity, they were not monsters. They were a family, grieving a profound loss. I emerged from the collapsing, fiery wreck of the cabin, the heat at my back. I walked over to Jonas, my boots crunching on the fine layer of black ash that now coated the ground. I held out the scorched but still recognizable baseball cap. Henderson timber, I said, my voice hoarse from the smoke. Jonas looked up from his fallen brother, his eyes filled with a grief that quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard fury. He took the cap from my hand, his knuckles white. I have a theory, I continued, laying it out for him. Someone didn't want you logging here. Someone wanted you gone. Not just your business, but your pack. So they found a ritual, something old and terrible, and they brought that thing here to clear the forest of their competition. Jonas's face became a mask of stone. He stared at the logo on the cap, the pieces connecting in his mind as they had in mine. Human greed. It was always human greed. It had brought this curse to his home, and it had cost one of his own their life. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something other than suspicion or command in his eyes. It was a sliver of gratitude. Not to a hired gun, but to an ally who had stood with them against a common enemy. The pack gently lifted the body of their fallen brother. Without another word, they began the slow, somber procession back out of the dark wood. The forest around us already seemed different, as if a great sickness had been purged from it. The silence of our return journey was heavier and more profound than the sounds of the battle had ever been. We were nearly free of the dark wood's oppressive canopy, the trees beginning to look healthy and alive again when we saw them. A second group from the pack was waiting on the trail ahead. They weren't alone. Held firmly between two of the werewolves in their human forms was a short, paunchy man in an expensive Gore-Tex jacket, his face pale with sweat and abject terror. It was Arthur Henderson. Jonas walked forward, his stride heavy and deliberate. The pack parted to let him through. He stopped directly in front of Henderson, who was trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. Jonas didn't speak. He simply held up the scorched baseball cap, the Henderson Timber logo facing the man who owned it. Henderson's eyes widened, all the blood draining from his face. He looked from the cap to Jonas's glacial, unblinking stare, then to the ring of grim-faced, imposing figures and their wounded comrades surrounding him. The facade of the ruthless businessman shattered completely. Under the weight of their silent judgment, he broke. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. The book. It was just an old folklore text I bought at an estate sale. It described a ritual to call a guardian spirit to drive away trespassers. It spoke of symbols, of using a heart from a fresh kill to anchor it. I thought it was just superstition, a way to scare you off. My company was going bankrupt. I had to do something. I never imagined it would be a real monster. I swear I didn't know it would kill people. He dissolved into blubbering sobs, begging for his life, for mercy, for understanding. Jonas listened to the entire confession with an expression of pure, cold granite. He let the man's pleas hang in the quiet forest air until they faded into desperate, gulping breaths. Then he gave a short, sharp nod to the two men holding Henderson. They grabbed the terrified businessman by the arms and began to drag him off the path, back into the deepening shadows of the woods. "What will happen to him?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "He broke the law of the forest," Jonas replied, his voice a low, hollow sound. He didn't turn to look at me or at the man being taken away. "Now he will face the forest's judgment. This is no longer your concern, Hunter." The sounds of Henderson's struggles and pleas faded quickly into the dense woods. I followed Jonas and the rest of the pack back toward Pinerest. The town, when we reached its edge, seemed transformed. The oppressive, fearful atmosphere was gone, as if a storm had broken. The air felt clean and light. Jonas walked with me all the way to the door of my motel room. He handed me a heavy canvas bag. It was the second half of my payment, plus a few extra stacks of bills. "For unforeseen risks," he said simply. "And for your help." His eyes met mine, and the wariness was gone, replaced by a raw, weary respect. He turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the parking lot, a shadow among shadows. "If the winds ever bring you north again, Caleb," he said, using my first name for the first and only time, "know that you have no enemies in this forest." He didn't offer friendship or welcome. He offered a truce, a pact. And coming from him, it was the highest honor he could bestow. Then he melted into the darkness and was gone. The next morning, the sun actually broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the damp streets of Pinerest. I paid a visit to the sheriff's office. Wallace looked up from his crossword puzzle, surprised to see me. "It's done," I told him, keeping my tone flat and professional. "The problem with the predator has been resolved." "The bear?" he asked, a hopeful note in his voice. "It wasn't a bear," I said. "It was a wolf, an outlier. Abnormally large, unusually aggressive, a lone male driven out of its pack. I tracked it deep into the logging territory. It was rabid, I think. Had to put it down. Buried the carcass out there. Didn't want to cause a panic bringing it back." The relief that washed over Wallace's face was almost comical. I had handed him a neat, tidy story that required no difficult questions, and more importantly, no complicated paperwork. He had the mayor breathing down his neck, the town on the verge of panic, and tourist season about to crash and burn. My simple story of a lone, rabid wolf was a gift-wrapped solution to all his problems, and he grabbed it with both hands. He shook my hand vigorously, thanking me for my quick and discreet work. As I left his office, the town's rumor mill was already churning with a new story: the disappearance of Arthur Henderson. His fancy SUV had been found abandoned at a trailhead leading into the dark wood. The official theory, which Wallace would no doubt champion, was that Henderson, an inexperienced hiker, had foolishly gone for a walk in the woods and had likely become the final tragic victim of that same aggressive wolf. The case would be closed within a week. Over the next day, as I prepared to leave, I saw the first signs of the new order. The massive, powerful logging trucks of the Northern Pine Company began rolling out, heading towards the territories that had, until yesterday, belonged to Henderson Timber. The forest's judgment had been swift, and the spoils went to the victors. The law of the forest had asserted itself not just in matters of spirit and flesh, but in economics too. On my way out of town, I stopped at the general store for some coffee for the road. As I came out, I saw Leo. He was stacking firewood against the side of the building. He looked up and our eyes met. The pained, ashamed boy was gone. In his place was a young man who looked 10 years older, his gaze steady and clear. He gave me a slow, single nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect between two people who had survived the same fire. On his forearm, peeking out from under his sleeve, I saw the faint, silvery scar left by my trap, a permanent reminder of his youthful recklessness and the lesson it had taught him. Back in my motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and emptied the canvas bag. The piles of cash seemed unreal. It was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. But I felt no thrill, no sense of accomplishment, only a profound weight. I had come here as a hunter of monsters, a purveyor of a specific violent kind of order. But I had been a tool, a scalpel wielded by one supernatural power against another. I had helped a pack of werewolves destroy an ancient spirit, and in doing so helped them deliver their own brutal justice to the human who was far more monstrous than any of them. The world was not a simple binary of human and monster. It was a tangled gray mess. Before I packed my gear, I performed one last ritual. I took the evidence I had collected, the plaster cast of the hybrid track, the baggie of black fur, the vial of saliva, and carried it out behind the motel. In a rusty metal trash barrel, I built a small fire and watched as each piece of the truth of Pinerest turned to ash and smoke, a secret the wind would carry away. The mystery had to die with me. I loaded the last of my things into the bed of my F-150, threw the empty canvas bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot of the Pine Bough Motel, I didn't look back. The endless ribbon of the interstate stretched out before me, pulling me south, away from the cold, imposing wall of the northern forests. In my rearview mirror, the towering pines of Oregon sank below the horizon, and with them, the weight of their secrets. I felt older. Not just tired, but fundamentally changed, as if some part of my soul had been scoured clean by the cold mountain air. My satellite phone buzzed on the seat beside me. It was my handler, the disembodied voice that fed me contracts and filtered the world's nightmares into manageable, payable jobs. "Caleb, heard it went well up north, quiet and clean, just how we like it," his cheerful voice crackled. "Good work. Listen, I've got another one for you if you're interested. Something brewing in the old mining towns of West Virginia. Strange sightings. They're talking about a winged man with red eyes, a real Mothman flap." For years, I would have just grunted an affirmative and asked for the coordinates. It was the job. It was what I did. But this time, the words caught in my throat. I thought of Jonas's grief-stricken face, of Leo's nod of acknowledgement, of the brutal but understandable justice the forest had exacted on Henderson. "I need a break," I said, the words surprising even me. I ended the call before he could argue, the sudden silence in the cab feeling both empty and liberating. Hours later, I pulled into a dusty, isolated gas station somewhere in Nevada. The air was hot and dry, a welcome contrast to the perpetual dampness of the north. Inside, a small television was playing a national news segment. The anchor was reporting on a minor business story. In regional acquisitions, the struggling Henderson Timber Company of Oregon has been completely bought out by its local competitor, Northern Pine Logging, following the tragic disappearance and presumed death of its owner, Arthur Henderson. Analysts call it a savvy move by Northern Pine to consolidate its hold on the region. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly clean. A footnote in the business section. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. They were the hands of a hunter, a killer of monsters. But this time, I hadn't just killed a monster. I had served as an instrument of a different kind of law. I had helped one pack of predators eliminate another, and in the process, enabled them to punish the man whose mundane human greed was the source of all the horror. I was beginning to understand. There are two kinds of laws in this world. There are the laws of man, written on paper, full of loopholes and gray areas, designed to be bent and broken. And then there is the law of the forest, ancient, unwritten, and absolute. It is brutal and unforgiving, but in its own way, it is perfectly just. And I realized that sometimes, to restore a semblance of order, you have to understand which law holds dominion. I started the truck. The engine rumbled, a familiar, comforting sound. The nose of the F-150 pointed south, towards the warm, murky swamps of home. I didn't know if I would ever take another job, if I would ever again answer the call to hunt what lurks in the dark. But I knew one thing for certain. The world I tried so hard to keep in order would always have its wild, untamable corners, places governed by their own primeval rules. And for the first time in a very long time, that thought didn't frighten me. It was, in a strange way, a comfort.